When muggers surrounded Christopher Moore in the hospital parking lot after his night shift, they saw an easy target, a quiet single father working security to support his 8-year-old daughter Isabella. What they didn't know was that this soft-spoken man was a former Army hand-to-hand combat instructor whose gentle demeanor concealed years of military training that had turned his hands into weapons and his mind into a tactical computer. Tonight, when local gang members threatened not just him but his daughter's safety at school, Christopher's hidden past would explode into the present in ways that would shock everyone who thought they knew him, revealing that sometimes the most ordinary-looking person can possess the most extraordinary and dangerous capabilities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Community Medical Center cast long shadows across the empty corridors as Christopher Moore adjusted his security badge for the third time that evening. His weathered hands, calloused from years of physical work, moved with practiced precision as he checked the radio clipped to his belt. The midnight shift at the hospital had become routine over the past 2 years, but something felt different tonight. And tension hung in the air like the antiseptic smell that never quite left the building. Christopher walked slowly down the main corridor, his rubber-soled shoes making soft squeaking sounds against the polished linoleum floor. At 34, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for shyness. His sandy brown hair was neatly trimmed, and his green eyes held a depth that suggested he had seen more of the world than his current circumstances might indicate. The navy blue security uniform hung loosely on his lean frame, concealing the network of scars that crisscrossed his arms and torso, reminders of a life he rarely spoke about. The emergency room buzzed with its usual late-night activity. Christopher nodded to the night staff as he passed, receiving polite smiles in return. Ashley White looked up from her paperwork at the nurse's station, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had been working the night shift for 3 years, and Christopher had always been respectful and professional in their interactions. "Quiet night so far, Christopher," Ashley said, glancing at the clock that read 11:47 p.m. "That's good," Christopher replied, his voice carrying a slight rasp from years of shouting commands over military training grounds. "Quiet is what we want. Around here," Ashley smiled, returning to her charts. She had always wondered about Christopher's past. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way his eyes constantly scanned rooms when he entered them, that suggested more than just a security guard trying to make ends meet. But he was private about his life before the hospital, and she respected that boundary. Christopher continued his rounds, checking each floor methodically. The pediatric ward was peaceful, with only the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional cry from a restless child. He paused outside the children's cancer wing, thinking about Isabella. His daughter had been healthy her entire 8 years, but seeing sick children always reminded him how precious and fragile life could be. The elevator carried him to the 4th floor, where the administrative offices sat empty and dark. Christopher pulled out his flashlight and swept it across the reception area. Everything appeared normal, but his instincts, honed by 3 tours of duty in hostile territories, told him something was off. He had learned to trust those instincts. They had kept him alive when others hadn't been so fortunate. A sound from the stairwell caught his attention. It was subtle, barely audible over the hum of the hospital's ventilation system, but Christopher's trained ear picked it up immediately. Footsteps, trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. He reached for his radio but hesitated. Hospital. Policy required calling incidents through the proper channels, and Christopher had learned that jumping to conclusions could create more problems than it solved. Instead, he moved toward the stairwell door with practiced stealth. His movements were fluid and silent, a stark contrast to his usual casual gait. Years of military training had taught him how to move through hostile territory without detection, and those skills had never truly left him, despite his attempts to bury them beneath the routine of civilian life. Through the small window in the stairwell door, Christopher saw two figures descending from the 5th floor. They moved with the swagger of people who didn't belong in a hospital at midnight, their clothing dark and their behavior suspicious. One of them carried what appeared to be a crowbar, while the other kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Christopher's jaw tightened as he recognized the signs of trouble. His military training automatically assessed the situation. Two potential threats, armed with at least one weapon, operating in a building full of vulnerable patients and staff. The protective instincts that had made him an exceptional soldier and combat instructor began to surface, though he fought to keep them in check. He reached for his radio again, this time with purpose. Security to base. This is Christopher. I have two suspicious individuals in the east stairwell, 4th floor level, requesting backup and police notification. The response crackled through the radio immediately. Copy that, Christopher. Backup is en route. Maintain visual contact, but do not engage. Christopher almost smiled at the irony of that instruction. Do not engage had never been an option for him when innocent lives were at stake. But he was no longer Sergeant Christopher Moore of the Army's Elite Combat Training Division. He was just a security guard trying to keep his job and support his daughter. The two men emerged from the stairwell and began moving toward the elevator. Christopher stayed back, observing their movements and noting details that would help police later. The one with the crowbar was tall and thin, probably in his early 20s, with nervous energy that suggested either drugs or inexperience. The other was shorter but stockier, moving with more confidence and purpose. They pressed the elevator button, and Christopher realized they were heading down, possibly toward the emergency room where Ashley and the other night staff were working. His protective instincts flared again, and he found himself moving closer despite his training and hospital policy. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and the two men stepped inside. Christopher caught a glimpse of their faces in the elevator's fluorescent light, young, hard, with the look of people who had made violence a way of life. As the doors closed, he heard one of them laugh, a cold sound that made Christopher's hands clench involuntarily into fists. He took the stairs, moving quickly but quietly down to the ground floor. His radio crackled again. Christopher, back up. Is 2 minutes out. What's your location? Ground floor, following suspects toward the ER, Christopher replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. Negative, Christopher. Maintain distance and wait for backup. Christopher ignored the instruction. Through the stairwell door, he could see the two men approaching the nurse's station where Ashley sat alone, focused on her paperwork. The shorter man was saying something to his companion, gesturing toward the station with obvious intent. Every instinct Christopher had developed over years of protecting others screamed at him to act. These weren't soldiers in a foreign battlefield. They were predators, targeting innocent people in a place of healing. The distinction meant nothing to the part of him that had been trained to neutralize threats and protect the vulnerable. He pushed through the stairwell door, just as the two men reached the nurse's station. Ashley looked up with a professional smile that quickly faded when she saw their faces and the crowbar one of them carried. "Excuse me, gentlemen, visiting hours ended at 9, Ashley said, her voice steady, but her eyes showing the first hint of concern. The man with the crowbar grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "We're not here to visit anyone, sweetheart. We're here to make a withdrawal." Ashley's hand moved toward the phone, but the shorter man was quicker, reaching across the counter to grab her wrist. "I don't think so, lady. Just open the drug cabinet and nobody gets hurt." Christopher felt something shift inside him, like a switch being flipped. The quiet security guard facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of the warrior beneath. His breathing became more controlled, his stance more balanced, his eyes more focused. For the first time in 2 years, Sergeant Christopher Moore was beginning to surface. "Let her go," Christopher said, his voice carrying a new authority that made both men turn to look at him. The man with the crowbar laughed. "Or what, rent-a-cop? You going to write us a ticket?" Christopher took a step closer, his hands relaxed at his sides, but positioned for quick action. "This is your last warning. Let her go and leave the hospital." The shorter man released Ashley's wrist and pulled something from his jacket, a knife with a 6-inch blade that caught the fluorescent light. Big words for a guy with nothing but a flashlight and a radio. Christopher's eyes tracked the knife, automatically calculating angles, distances, and timing. His training took over, running threat assessments and tactical options in the background of his mind. But he also thought about Isabella, sleeping peacefully in their small apartment on Elm Street, trusting her father to come home safely every morning. "Ashley," Christopher said quietly, never taking his eyes off the two men, "step back from the counter." She moved immediately, recognizing something in Christopher's voice that she had never heard before, the tone of someone who knew exactly how dangerous the situation had become and was prepared to handle it. The man with the knife took a step toward Christopher, the blade held low and ready. "You should have minded your own business, security guard." Christopher's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of combat experience. "This is my business." In the distance, the sound of sirens began to grow louder, but Christopher knew they wouldn't arrive in time to prevent whatever was about to happen. The two men heard the sirens too, and their desperation was evident in their increasingly aggressive postures. The man with the crowbar moved toward Ashley again, while his companion kept the knife trained on Christopher. They were making a critical mistake, underestimating the man they thought was just another minimum-wage security guard. Christopher's military training assessed the situation one final time. 2 armed threats, innocent civilian in immediate danger, backup still minutes away. There was only one logical conclusion. It was time to stop being Christopher Moore, the security guard, and remember how to be Sergeant Moore, the combat instructor. The transformation began in his eyes, a subtle shift that would have been recognizable to anyone who had served in combat. The quiet father and dedicated employee was still there, but underneath, something much more dangerous was waking up. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The transformation that had begun in Christopher's eyes now spread through his entire body. His shoulders squared, his stance widened slightly, and his breathing became measured and controlled. The man with the knife sensed the change immediately, his own posture shifting from confident aggression to wary uncertainty. "You don't want to do this," Christopher said, his voice carrying a new edge that cut through the sterile hospital air. The shorter man with the knife sneered, but there was hesitation in his movements now. Big talk from a guy who's about to get carved up. Behind them, the man with the crowbar had moved closer to Ashley, who had backed against the wall of medical supplies. Her training as a nurse had taught her to remain calm in emergencies, but this situation was far beyond anything she had encountered during her years at Community Medical Center. Christopher's tactical mind calculated distances and angles with automatic precision. 6 feet to the knife wielder, another 4 feet to reach Ashley's attacker. The knife was being held incorrectly, amateur grip, too much wrist exposed. The crowbar posed a greater threat due to its reach, but the wielder was telegraphing his nervousness through constant shifting of weight from foot to foot. "Last chance," Christopher said, taking a half-step forward. "Walk away now, and this ends quietly." The man with the knife made his decision with a wild lunge forward, the blade aimed at Christopher's chest. What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds, but would replay in Ashley's memory for years to come. Christopher moved with fluid precision that seemed to slow time itself. He sidestepped the knife thrust while simultaneously grabbing the attacker's wrist with his left hand and driving his right elbow into the man's solar plexus. The knife clattered to the floor as its owner doubled over, gasping for air. Before the man could recover, Christopher's knee came up to meet his descending face, and the first attacker crumpled to the linoleum unconscious. The man with the crowbar had barely processed what he had witnessed when Christopher was already moving toward him. Years of combat training had taught Christopher that hesitation in battle meant death, and those lessons guided his actions now. "Stay back!" the crowbar wielder shouted, swinging wildly at Christopher's head. Christopher ducked under the swing and stepped inside the weapon's arc, where it became useless. His right hand shot out in a palm strike that connected with the man's sternum, sending him stumbling backward into a crash cart. Medical supplies scattered across the floor as the man struggled to regain his balance. The crowbar fell from nerveless fingers as Christopher followed up with a controlled strike to the attacker's throat. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to drop him to his knees, clutching his neck and fighting for breath. In less than 10 seconds, both attackers were neutralized. Christopher stood over them, breathing normally, his hands hanging loosely at his sides as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But Ashley had seen the truth. This quiet security guard possessed skills that belonged in a very different world than Community Medical Center. "Christopher," Ashley whispered, staring at him with wide eyes. "What just happened? How did you—" The sound of multiple vehicles arriving outside interrupted her question. Police sirens, ambulance engines, and the distinctive rumble of the hospital's security van all converged in the emergency room parking lot. Within moments, the automatic doors burst open as uniformed officers rushed inside, followed by Tom O'Brien, the senior security guard, and 2 paramedics. Detective Rachel Thompson was the first officer to assess the scene. A 20-year veteran of the Indianapolis Police Department, she had responded to countless hospital incidents, but the sight that greeted her was unusual. 2 suspects were down and apparently unconscious, while the security guard and nurse appeared unharmed but shaken. "What's the situation here?" Detective Thompson asked, her hand resting on her service weapon as she scanned for additional threats. Christopher had already returned to his civilian demeanor, the warrior persona submerging beneath the surface once again. 2 suspects attempted to rob the pharmacy. They threatened Nurse White with weapons, a knife and crowbar. I intervened to protect her safety. Detective Thompson looked from the unconscious attackers to Christopher, noting the absence of any visible injuries on the security guard. "You took down both of them yourself?" "They weren't professionals," Christopher replied simply. "More desperate than dangerous." Tom O'Brien, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had worked hospital security for 15 years, stared at the scene with obvious confusion. "Christopher, I've never seen anything like this. Where did you learn to fight like that?" Before Christopher, who could answer, Ashley found her voice. "He moved so fast. I've never seen anyone move like that outside of movies." It was like he knew exactly what they were going to do before they did it. Detective Thompson's experienced eyes studied Christopher more carefully. She had seen enough combat veterans to recognize certain tells, the way he stood, the controlled breathing, the constant environmental awareness that never quite shut off. "Mr. Moore, do you have military experience?" Christopher hesitated for a moment, considering his answer. "I served in the army for 8 years, infantry." It was the truth, but far from the complete truth. Sergeant Christopher Moore had been much more than infantry. He had been part of an elite training cadre that prepared special operations soldiers for close-quarters combat in hostile environments. His hands had been registered weapons, his tactical knowledge had been classified, and his kill count had been something he tried never to think about. The paramedics were checking the two attackers, confirming that they were unconscious but stable. The man who had wielded the knife was beginning to stir, mumbling incoherently as consciousness slowly returned. His companion remained motionless, though his breathing was steady and strong. "We'll need statements from both of you, Detective," Thompson said, pulling out her notebook. "But first, I want to understand exactly what happened here." Ashley stepped forward, her professional composure returning as the immediate danger passed. "I was working on patient charts when these two men approached the nurses' station. They demanded access to the pharmacy and threatened me when I refused. One of them grabbed my wrist, and that's when Christopher intervened." "They were armed?" Detective Thompson asked. "The tall one had a crowbar, the shorter one had a knife. When Christopher told them to leave, they became aggressive. The one with the knife attacked first." Detective Thompson turned to Christopher. "Walk me through your response step by step." Christopher's account was precise and factual, delivered in the clipped tones that Ashley was beginning to recognize as his military training showing through. He described the attackers' positions, their weapons, the threat to Ashley, and his decision to engage. What he didn't describe was the automatic tactical assessment, the split-second calculations, or the muscle memory that had guided his movements. Tom O'Brien shook his head in amazement. "In 15 years of hospital security, I've called the police plenty of times, but I've never had to handle anything like this myself. Most of the time, we just wait for backup. Sometimes backup doesn't arrive in time," Christopher said quietly. Detective Thompson made notes as she spoke. "Mr. Moore, your military service, what unit were you with?" "Massachusetts 2nd Airborne Division, Fort Bragg." Again, true but incomplete. Christopher had indeed been stationed at Fort Bragg, but his work with the Combat Training Division had taken him to facilities and missions that didn't appear on standard military records. "How long have you been working at the hospital?" 2 years, 3 months. "Any previous incidents like this?" "No. Usually problems are handled by talking them out or waiting for police backup." Detective Thompson studied the two unconscious men, both of whom were now being loaded onto gurneys by the paramedics. "These two are going to need medical attention before they can be processed. Looks like you did a number on them without causing any permanent damage." Christopher nodded, though he didn't mention that causing permanent damage had been a conscious choice. His training had included techniques for neutralizing threats permanently, but he had used only enough force to end the immediate danger. "I'll need you both to come to the station tomorrow to complete your statements," Detective Thompson said. "In the meantime, we'll have additional patrols around the hospital tonight." As the police and paramedics prepared to leave with the two attackers, Ashley approached Christopher. Her earlier shock had been replaced by curiosity and something that might have been admiration. "Christopher, I need to ask you something," she said, keeping her voice low so the others couldn't hear. "What you did back there, that wasn't just basic military training, was it?" Christopher met her eyes, seeing intelligence and genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. Ashley was a good person, someone who had always treated him with respect and kindness. She deserved an honest answer, even if it couldn't be a complete one. "I had specialized training," he said carefully. "Combat situations require different skills than most people learn." "Specialized how?" Christopher was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. "I taught hand-to-hand combat to other soldiers. It was my job to make sure they could protect themselves and their units in close-quarter situations." Ashley's eyes widened slightly as the implications sank in. "You were an instructor? Teaching other soldiers how to fight?" "Yes. And you've been working here for 2 years, checking doors and walking empty hallways." It's honest work. It supports my daughter. Ashley looked around the emergency room, where normal activity was slowly resuming as the police finished their work. Christopher, you could probably get a job with private security, maybe corporate protection. The pay would be much better. I like quiet jobs, Christopher replied. I've had enough excitement to last a lifetime. Tom O'Brien approached them, still shaking his head in disbelief. Christopher, I've been meaning to ask you about your background since you started working here. Tonight explains a lot about why you're so good at this job. What do you mean? The way you move through the building, how you notice things other people miss, the way you can spot trouble before it starts. I always figured you had some kind of police or military background. Christopher smiled slightly. You notice a lot yourself, Tom. 20 years as a city cop before I came here, but what you did tonight, that was something else entirely. The last of the police officers were preparing to leave when Detective Thompson returned to speak with Christopher privately. Mr. Moore, I want you to know that your actions tonight prevented what could have been a very serious situation. Hospital robberies often escalate into violence against staff and patients. I was just doing my job. No, you were doing much more than that. Most security guards would have waited for backup, which would have been the smart thing to do. What made you decide to engage? Christopher glanced toward Ashley, who was speaking with one of the paramedics about the medical evaluation of the two attackers. She was in immediate danger. Waiting wasn't an option. Detective Thompson followed his gaze and nodded with understanding. I see. Well, your military training certainly came in handy tonight. It's not something I like to use, but you're glad you had it when you needed it. Christopher considered this. Yes, I suppose I am. After the police left and the hospital returned to its normal nighttime routine, Christopher and Ashley found themselves alone in the break room, each trying to process what had happened. Ashley poured coffee for both of them, her hands still slightly unsteady from the adrenaline. I keep thinking about how quickly it all happened, she said, sitting across from Christopher at the small table. 1 minute I was working on charts. The next minute you were... I don't even know how to describe it. Combat situations happen fast. Training helps you react without thinking. Is that what it was like when you were in the army? Christopher sipped his coffee, considering how to answer. Sometimes. Different environments, different threats, but the principles are the same. Do you miss it? The question caught Christopher off guard. It was something he had asked himself many times over the past 2 years, usually late at night when Isabella was sleeping and the apartment felt too quiet. I miss the certainty, he said finally. In the military, you know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. You know what your mission is and how to complete it. Civilian life is more complicated. Ashley nodded thoughtfully. But you have Isabella now. That must make the complications worthwhile. Christopher's expression softened at the mention of his daughter. She's everything to me, every decision I make, every job I take. It's all about giving her the best life I can. She's lucky to have you as a father. I hope so. Sometimes I worry that my past makes me less suitable as a parent. What happened tonight suggests the opposite. You protected someone who needed protection. That's exactly the kind of father any child would want. Christopher looked at Ashley across the small table, seeing her in a new light. She had remained calm under pressure, had trusted his judgment without question, and was now offering understanding rather than fear or suspicion. About his background, thank you, he said simply. For what? For not being afraid of me after what you saw. Ashley reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. Christopher, what I saw was someone willing to risk himself to help others. That's not frightening. That's heroic. As they sat in the quiet break room, both of them knew that something fundamental had changed between them. The events of the night had revealed aspects of Christopher's character that had been hidden beneath the surface of the quiet security guard, and Ashley found herself seeing him as more than just a colleague. Outside, the Indianapolis skyline glittered in the pre-dawn darkness, and somewhere in the city, other dangerous people were making plans that would soon bring Christopher's past into collision with his present in ways he couldn't yet imagine. 3 days after the hospital incident, Christopher sat in the cramped office of 24/7 Security Solutions, facing his supervisor, Jake Wilson, across a desk cluttered with incident reports and coffee-stained paperwork. The morning sun streamed through dirty Venetian blinds, casting alternating strips of light and shadow across Wilson's weathered face. "Christopher, I've got the police report right here," Wilson said, tapping a manila folder with his index finger. "Detective Thompson called me personally to discuss what happened at Community Medical Center." Christopher remained silent, his hands folded in his lap as he waited for whatever was coming next. He had expected this conversation, though he wasn't entirely sure what direction it would take. 2 armed suspects, both neutralized, no injuries to hospital staff or patients. Wilson continued reading from the report. "The detective was very complimentary about your actions, but she also had some questions about your background." "What kind of questions?" Wilson leaned back in his chair, which squeaked in protest. "The kind that make me realize I don't know nearly enough about the guy I've had walking hospital corridors for the past 2 years. She mentioned specialized military training." Christopher chose his words carefully. "I served 8 years in the Army. I included that information on my employment application." "Yeah, you did. What you didn't include was that you were some kind of combat instructor who could take down armed attackers like they were children. You never asked for specifics about my military service." Wilson studied Christopher's face, looking for tells that might reveal more than the man was willing to. "Say directly. I'm asking now, what exactly did you do in the Army?" Christopher had prepared for this question, knowing it would come eventually. "I was an instructor at the Army Combative School at Fort Benning. I taught hand-to-hand combat techniques to infantry soldiers and special operations personnel." The admission hung in the air between them. Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly as he processed the implications. "Special operations personnel," Wilson repeated slowly. "Like Rangers, Green Berets?" "Among others," Wilson whistled softly. "And now you're working hospital security for $12 an hour. It's steady work with benefits. My daughter needs stability." "Christopher, do you have any idea what someone with your qualifications could make in executive protection? Corporate security? I've got contacts who would pay you 3 times what you're making here." Christopher shook his head. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested in that kind of work anymore." "Why not?" "Because that kind of work follows you home." Wilson seemed to understand something in Christopher's tone that warned against pushing further. Instead, he opened another folder on his desk. "Well, whether you want it or not, your situation may be changing. The hospital administrator, Dr. Amanda Clark, has requested that you be assigned permanently to the night shift at Community Medical Center. She's also authorized a pay increase." Christopher frowned. "I haven't asked for any special treatment." "Apparently you don't need to ask. After what happened the other night, the hospital considers you a valuable asset. They want to make sure you don't go anywhere else." The conversation was interrupted by Wilson's phone ringing. He answered it with his usual gruff tone, but his expression quickly changed to one of concern. "What? When? Is anyone hurt?" Wilson asked, grabbing a pen to take notes. "Yeah, I understand. We'll handle it." He hung up and looked at Christopher with a grim expression. "That was Community Medical Center. There's been another incident." Christopher felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of incident?" "Someone threw a brick through the window of the pharmacy around 3 this morning. Night security found a note attached to it." "What did the note say?" Wilson consulted his hastily scrawled notes. "Tell your security guard that Richard Taylor doesn't forget. This isn't over. The name hit Christopher like a physical blow. Richard Taylor, the man Detective Thompson had mentioned, was the suspected, leader of a local gang involved in drug trafficking and robbery. The same man whose associates Christopher had neutralized 3 nights ago. Christopher, do you recognize that name? Detective Thompson mentioned it during my statement. Apparently the 2 men I stopped work for him. Wilson leaned forward, his expression serious. This changes things. If this Taylor character is targeting you specifically, then you're not just a security guard who happened to be in the right place at the right time. You're a target. Christopher's mind was already shifting into tactical mode, assessing threats and calculating protective measures. His primary concern wasn't for himself. He had faced worse enemies in more dangerous situations. His concern was for Isabella. I need to make a phone call, Christopher said, standing up. To who? My daughter's school. Wilson nodded grimly. Good thinking. I'll call Detective Thompson and let her know about the threat. Christopher stepped outside the security office and dialed Madison Elementary School. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of traffic from the nearby interstate. Madison Elementary, this is Mrs. Coleman, came the cheerful voice of the school secretary. Mrs. Coleman, this is Christopher Moore, Isabella Moore's. Father, I need to speak with Principal Martinez about a security concern. 1 moment, please. While he waited, Christopher scanned the parking lot and surrounding area with automatic vigilance. His military training had taught him that threats could come from anywhere at any time, and that preparation was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Mr. Moore, this is Principal Martinez. Mrs. Coleman mentioned a security concern. Christopher explained the situation carefully, providing enough detail to convey the seriousness without causing panic. Principal Martinez listened without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions. We take threats against our students and their families very seriously, Principal Martinez said. I'll make sure our office staff and teachers are aware to watch for any suspicious activity around Isabella. We'll also coordinate with the school resource officer. I appreciate that. I may need to adjust her pickup arrangements for the next few days. Of course, just let us know what you need. After ending the call, Christopher stood in the parking lot for several minutes, thinking through his options. Richard Taylor had made this personal by threatening him directly, which meant the gang leader knew his name and probably his address. That information could have come from the 2 men who had been arrested or from other sources. His phone buzzed with a text message. From Ashley. Heard about the pharmacy window. Are you okay? Christopher typed back. I'm fine, working late tonight. We'll call you later. He didn't mention that he wouldn't be working his regular security rounds. Instead, he would be conducting reconnaissance on Richard Taylor and his associates, using skills he had hoped never to need again. That afternoon, Christopher picked up Isabella from school early, telling her teacher that they had a family appointment. As they walked to his aging Honda Civic, Isabella chattered about her day, oblivious to the tension that had taken hold of her father's life. Daddy, why are you looking around so much? Isabella asked as Christopher buckled her seatbelt. Just checking traffic, sweetheart. You always check traffic, but today you're checking it more. Christopher smiled despite his concerns. Isabella was observant, a trait she had inherited from him, along with her mother's dark hair and expressive eyes. You're right. Daddy's just being extra careful today. Is something wrong? Christopher considered how much to tell her. Isabella was mature for her 8 years, but she was still a child who deserved to feel safe and protected. Some people at work are having problems, and I want to make sure those problems don't affect our family. Isabella nodded solemnly. Like when Tommy's dad lost his job and they had to move? Something like that. They drove to Christopher's mother's house in a quiet residential neighborhood 15 minutes from their apartment. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson was a retired teacher who had raised 5 children and could handle whatever challenges her granddaughter might present. "Mom, I need Isabella to stay with you for a few days," Christopher said as they stood in the kitchen of the modest 2-story home where he had grown up. Mrs. Peterson studied her son's face with the practiced eye of someone who had been reading his moods for 34 years. "What's going on, Christopher?" "Work situation. Nothing I can't handle, but I want Isabella somewhere safe while I deal with it." "Does this have anything to do with what happened at the hospital? I saw it on the news." Christopher wasn't surprised that his mother had connected the dots. She had always been sharp, and the news report had mentioned his name as the security guard who had stopped the robbery attempt. "It's related," he admitted. Mrs. Peterson nodded, accepting the explanation without demanding details she knew her son wouldn't provide. "Isabella can stay as long as necessary. But Christopher, if you're in real danger, maybe you should call the police. The police are aware of the situation. That's not what I meant, and you know it." Christopher kissed his mother's cheek and hugged Isabella goodbye, promising to call her every day. As he drove away from the familiar neighborhood, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar piece of equipment. That evening, instead of reporting to Community Medical Center, Christopher parked his car 6 blocks away from a warehouse district on the east side of Indianapolis. According to Detective Thompson's files, which he had obtained through carefully cultivated contacts, Richard Taylor's operation was based somewhere in this area. Christopher moved through the industrial landscape with practiced stealth, using shadows and abandoned buildings for concealment. His civilian clothes had been replaced with dark clothing that wouldn't reflect light or make noise when moving through tight spaces. The warehouse district was a maze of empty buildings, loading docks, and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Many of the structures showed signs of abandonment: broken windows, rusted metal siding, weeds growing through cracked pavement. But some showed recent activity: tire tracks in the dirt, cigarette butts that hadn't been weathered by rain, and the lingering smell of exhaust from vehicles that had been there recently. Christopher found what he was looking for in a converted auto repair shop that backed up to a set of railroad tracks. Through a grimy window, he could see several men sitting around a card table, money and drugs visible on the surface. One of them matched the description Detective Thompson had provided for Richard Taylor: average height, stocky build, distinctive tattoo on his neck. As Christopher watched, 2 more men entered the building through a side door. One of them was limping slightly and had a bandage on his face, the man who had attacked him with the knife at the hospital. The conversation inside became animated, with gestures and raised voices that suggested they were discussing plans rather than playing cards. Christopher moved closer, using a drainage pipe to reach a position where he could hear fragments of the discussion. "Security guard thinks he's some kind of hero. Find out where he lives. Make an example. His kid goes to Madison Elementary." The last fragment made Christopher's blood run cold. They knew about Isabella. The threat had escalated beyond professional retaliation to something much more personal and dangerous. Christopher had heard enough. He retreated from his observation point and made his way back to his car, his mind already formulating a plan. Richard Taylor and his associates had made a critical error by threatening his daughter. They had transformed this from a simple criminal matter into something that required a very different kind of response. As he drove through the quiet streets of Indianapolis, Christopher felt the last vestiges of his civilian persona falling away. The quiet security guard, who wanted nothing more than to provide a stable life for his daughter, was still there, but he was no longer in control. Sergeant Christopher Moore, combat instructor and warrior, was taking command of the situation. And unlike the hospital incident, which had required restraint and measured force, this new threat called for capabilities that Christopher had hoped never to use again. The war was coming to Indianapolis, and Richard Taylor had no idea what kind of enemy he had just made. 2 days later, Christopher stood in the shadows outside Madison Elementary School at 7:30 a.m., watching the morning arrival routine with tactical precision. Parents dropped off children, school buses pulled into the circular drive, and crossing. Guards took their positions at key intersections. Everything appeared normal, but Christopher's trained eye noted details that most people would miss. A dark blue sedan had been parked across the street for 20 minutes with its engine running. The driver kept glancing toward the school entrance while speaking on his phone. 2 blocks away, another vehicle, a gray pickup truck, had made 3 passes through the neighborhood in the past hour. Christopher's phone vibrated with a text. From Detective Rachel Thompson. Can you meet me at Pete's Cafe in 1 hour? We need to discuss the Taylor situation. He typed back his confirmation while maintaining visual contact with the suspicious sedan. As parents and children continued their morning routines, oblivious to the potential danger, Christopher made a decision that would fundamentally change how he approached the threat against his family. The sedan's driver ended his phone call and pulled away from the curb, but not before Christopher memorized the license plate number and noted the man's physical description. Average height, thin build, baseball cap pulled low to obscure his features. Classic surveillance behavior that confirmed Christopher's worst fears. Inside Pete's Cafe, Detective Thompson was already seated in a corner booth with her back to the wall. A habit Christopher recognized from his own military training. The morning crowd of construction workers and early commuters provided good background noise for their conversation. Thanks for meeting me, Thompson said as Christopher slid into the opposite seat. We've had some developments in the Taylor case that you need to know about. Christopher ordered black coffee from the waitress and waited for Thompson to continue. The 2 men you stopped at the hospital have been released on bail, she said, keeping her voice low. Sean Davis and Brad Johnson. Both have extensive criminal records, and both are known associates of Richard Taylor. When were they released? Yesterday afternoon. Their bail was posted by someone using cash, $50,000 total. Christopher absorbed this information while calculating the implications. Professional criminals with that level of financial backing meant Taylor's operation was more sophisticated than a typical street gang. There's more, Thompson continued. We've been watching Taylor's known associates, and there's been increased activity around several locations. Phone intercepts suggest they're planning something bigger than just retaliation against you. What kind of something? We're not sure yet, but the chatter indicates they're moving significant amounts of money and drugs. Your hospital incident may have disrupted a larger operation. Christopher sipped his coffee, thinking about the surveillance he had observed at Isabella's school. Detective, I think they're already moving against my family. He described the suspicious vehicles and surveillance activity around Madison Elementary. Thompson took notes while listening, her expression growing more concerned. I can arrange for increased patrols around the school and your apartment, she offered. That won't be enough. What do you mean? Christopher met her eyes across the table. I mean that reactive security measures won't stop someone who's determined to hurt my daughter. These aren't opportunistic criminals. They're organized, well-funded, and they've made this personal. Thompson studied Christopher's face, recognizing something in his tone that hadn't been there during their previous conversations. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that the best defense is sometimes a good offense. Christopher, I need you to be very careful about what you're suggesting. Vigilante justice isn't justice at all. It's just more violence. I'm not talking about vigilante justice. I'm talking about protecting my family using whatever means are necessary. Thompson leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. What exactly did you do in the army? And don't give me the abbreviated version this time. Christopher was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. I was part of a special training cadre that prepared soldiers for unconventional warfare situations. We taught combat techniques, tactical planning, and survival skills to personnel who were going into hostile environments where the normal rules of engagement didn't apply. Covert operations, among other things. Thompson sat back in her seat, processing the implications. So when you say you're thinking about offensive measures, I'm thinking about eliminating the threat before it eliminates my family. Their conversation was interrupted by Christopher's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Madison Elementary School, and Christopher answered immediately. "Mr. Moore? This is Principal Martinez. We've had an incident involving Isabella." Christopher's blood ran cold. "What kind of incident?" "She's fine," Principal Martinez said quickly, "but a man approached her during morning recess and tried to start a conversation. Our playground supervisor intervened immediately, and the man left when she approached." "Did anyone get a description?" "Yes. Medium height, thin build, wearing a baseball cap. He claimed to be looking for his lost dog, but Isabella said he knew her name." Christopher closed his eyes, fighting the surge of protective rage that threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking. It was the same man from the surveillance sedan. "Where is Isabella now?" "In my office with the school counselor. She's not upset, but we thought you should know immediately." "I'm on my way." Christopher ended the call and looked at Detective Thompson, who had overheard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened. "They've made contact with my daughter," he said, his voice deadly calm. "I'll get units to the school right away." "It's too late for that. They've already established that they can reach her whenever they want." Christopher stood up, leaving money on the table for his untouched coffee. "Detective, I need you to understand something. I've spent 2 years trying to be a normal civilian, working a quiet job and raising my daughter in peace, but these people have just crossed a line that changes everything." "Christopher, wait. Let's think this through." "I have thought it through. The time for thinking is over." Christopher left Pete's Cafe and drove to Madison Elementary with controlled urgency. His mind was operating on multiple levels simultaneously, the concerned father rushing to comfort his daughter, and the tactical planner already formulating a response to the direct threat against her safety. Principal Martinez met him in the main office, where Isabella sat in a chair next to the school counselor, looking more curious than frightened. When she saw her father, she jumped up and ran to him. "Daddy, a man asked me about my dog, but we don't have a dog." Christopher knelt down and hugged Isabella, checking her carefully for any signs of distress. "Are you okay, sweetheart? Did the man touch you or try to get you to go anywhere with him?" "No, he just asked about the dog and said he knew you, but Mrs. Williams came over and he went away." Christopher looked up at the playground supervisor, Mrs. Williams, who had joined them in the office. "The whole interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds, Mrs. Williams said. "Isabella handled it perfectly. She stayed where she was and didn't engage with the stranger. But something about the man bothered me, so I approached to see what he wanted." "What did he say to you?" "He claimed he was looking for a lost dog and thought Isabella might have seen it. When I asked him to describe the dog, he became vague and said he needed to check other areas of the neighborhood." Principal Martinez stepped forward. "Mr. Moore, we've already reviewed our security procedures with the staff. No unauthorized persons should be able to access the playground during school hours. How did he get onto school property? That's what concerns us. He would have had to climb the fence or find another way around our normal security measures." Christopher's tactical mind noted the implications. The approach to Isabella hadn't been random or opportunistic. It had required planning, reconnaissance, and deliberate action to circumvent school security. This wasn't intimidation. It was a demonstration of capability. "I'm taking Isabella." "Oh," Christopher said, "of course. Will she be returning to school tomorrow?" Christopher looked at his daughter, who was listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus that children display when they sense something important is happening. "I'm not sure yet." After completing the necessary paperwork and speaking with the police officers who had arrived to take a report, Christopher drove Isabella to his mother's house. During the 20-minute drive, he used the time to assess his daughter's emotional state and explain the situation in terms she could understand. "Isabella, do you remember when we talked about strangers and how you should never go anywhere with someone you don't know?" "Yes, and I should find a grown-up I trust if a stranger tries to talk to me." "That's right. You did exactly the right thing today by staying where you were and letting Mrs. Williams handle the situation." Isabella was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Daddy, is someone trying to hurt us?" The question hit Christopher like a physical blow. He had hoped to shield her from the reality of their situation, but Isabella was too intelligent to be fooled by vague explanations. "Some people are angry with me because of something that happened at work," he said carefully. "I don't think they want to hurt us, but they might try to scare us, like bullies at school. Something like that. What do you do about bullies?" Christopher smiled despite the gravity of their situation. "What did I teach you about bullies? You stand up to them, but you try not to fight unless you have to." "That's right. So you're going to stand up to the people who are trying to scare us?" Christopher pulled into his mother's driveway and turned to look at his daughter. Isabella's dark eyes held trust and confidence that her father would protect her from whatever dangers threatened their family. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to stand up to them." "Will that make them stop being bullies?" "I think it will." That evening, after Isabella was safely settled at her grandmother's house, Christopher returned to his apartment on Elm Street to prepare for what he knew was coming. The small two-bedroom space felt different now, no longer a sanctuary, but a potential battlefield. He moved through the apartment systematically, noting sightlines, cover positions, and potential entry points. His military training evaluated the tactical situation, while his civilian mind struggled with the reality of what he was planning. Christopher opened a locked closet in his bedroom and removed a metal box that he hadn't touched in 2 years. Inside were items from his military service that he had kept but hoped never to need again. Night vision equipment, tactical knives, flexible restraints, and other tools of his former profession. As he prepared the equipment and planned his approach to Richard Taylor's operation, Christopher felt the last remnants of his civilian identity falling away. The quiet security guard who wanted nothing more than a peaceful life with his daughter was gone, replaced by the warrior who had trained elite soldiers and survived multiple combat deployments. Tomorrow night, Richard Taylor and his associates would discover what it meant to threaten the family of someone who had spent 8 years learning how to eliminate threats efficiently and permanently. The hunter was about to become the hunted. At 11:47 p.m., Christopher moved through the warehouse, district like a shadow, his dark clothing and tactical gear rendering him nearly invisible in the industrial landscape. 3 nights of reconnaissance had provided him with detailed intelligence about Richard Taylor's operation, guard rotations, entry points, security measures, and the location of key personnel. The converted auto repair shop sat in darkness, except for 2 windows showing dim light from the back office. Christopher's night vision equipment revealed 2 sentries posted outside, one smoking a cigarette near the main entrance, the other leaning against a chain-link fence while talking on his phone. Both were armed with handguns tucked into their waistbands, but neither was maintaining proper security protocols. Christopher approached from the railroad tracks behind the building, using abandoned rail cars for concealment. His military training had taught him that most security failures occurred from overlooking obvious approach routes, and criminal organizations rarely invested in proper perimeter defense. The rear of the building had a loading dock with a roll-up door that was secured by a simple padlock. Christopher examined the lock mechanism with a small penlight, determining that it could be defeated in less than 30 seconds with the proper tools. However, his tactical assessment suggested a different approach would be more effective. Moving along the building's eastern wall, Christopher found what he was looking for: a ventilation grate approximately 8 feet above ground level. The vent provided access to the building's interior without triggering whatever alarm systems might be protecting the doors and windows. Christopher scaled the wall using techniques he had taught to special operations personnel, his movements fluid and silent. The ventilation grate was secured with 4 screws that had been painted over multiple times, indicating they hadn't been removed in years. Using a multi-tool from his kit, Christopher carefully loosened each screw until the grate could be lifted. Away! The ventilation shaft was narrow but navigable, designed to carry air from the building's heating system to the exterior. Christopher moved through the metal ductwork with practiced stealth, following the main trunk toward the sounds of conversation coming from the front of the building. Through a floor register, Christopher could observe the main room of the converted shop. 5 men sat around a table covered with cash, plastic bags of white powder, and several handguns. Richard Taylor was easy to identify from Detective Thompson's description: stocky build, neck tattoo, commanding presence that marked him as the leader. The hospital thing was supposed to be simple, Taylor was saying, counting a stack of $20 bills. Sean and Brad were supposed to grab some pharmaceuticals and get out. Instead, we've got cops crawling all over our business. One of the other men, whom Christopher recognized as Sean Davis from the hospital incident, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We didn't know the security guard was some kind of martial arts expert. He moved like he was in the Matrix or something. Taylor looked up from his money counting, his expression dangerous. I don't care if he was Jackie Chan. The point is, he made us look weak. People are going to think they can mess with our operation. So what's the plan? Asked a third man whom Christopher didn't recognize. The plan is to make an example. We've already shown his kid that we can reach her anytime we want. Tomorrow, we grab both of them, the security guard and his daughter. We make it clear what happens to people who interfere with our business. Christopher's jaw clenched as he listened to the casual discussion of kidnapping his daughter. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to act immediately, but his training demanded patience and tactical superiority before engagement. What about the cops? Sean Davis asked. They're watching us pretty close since the hospital thing. The cops are reactive, Taylor replied. They respond to crimes after they happen. By the time they figure out what we're doing, it'll be too late. Taylor stood up and walked to a wall map of Indianapolis that was marked with various locations. We've identified the security guard's apartment, his kid's school, his mother's house where the kid is staying now. We've got surveillance on all of them. Christopher memorized the marked locations on the map, noting that Taylor's intelligence was accurate and comprehensive. The gang leader had invested significant resources in learning about Christopher's family and routines. Here's how it's going to work, Taylor continued, pointing to different locations on the map. Tomorrow morning, we grab the kid when she's walking from the house to the school bus. Clean, simple, no witnesses. Then we use her to draw out the security guard. And then what? Asked another gang member. Then we show everyone in this neighborhood what happens when you mess with Richard Taylor. Christopher had heard enough. The immediate threat to Isabella required action, but his tactical training demanded that he neutralize the entire operation rather than just the visible threat. Half measures would leave his family vulnerable to future retaliation. Moving back through the ventilation system, Christopher positioned himself above the building's electrical panel, which was located in a utility closet adjacent to the main room. Using a small explosive charge designed for breaching operations, he disabled the building's main power supply. The lights went out instantly, plunging the building into complete darkness. Christopher heard chairs scraping and raised voices as the gang members reacted to the sudden blackout. What the hell happened to the lights? Check the breaker box. Somebody get some flashlights. Christopher dropped through a ceiling tile into the utility closet, landing silently in the darkness. His night vision equipment gave him a decisive advantage as he moved toward the main room where the gang members were fumbling with flashlights and cell phone lights. The first target was the man closest to the weapons on the table. Christopher approached from behind, using a sleeper hold that rendered the man unconscious in seconds. The technique, refined through years of training special operations personnel, was silent and effective. "Tony, where'd you go?" one of the others called out. Christopher was already moving toward his next target, a thin man who was trying to use his cell phone's flashlight to navigate toward the exit. A precise strike to the base of the skull dropped him without a sound. "I don't like this," Sean Davis said, his voice betraying growing panic. "Something's wrong here." "Shut up and find the damn breaker box," Taylor commanded, though his own voice carried an edge of concern. Christopher allowed them to find a working flashlight, using the beam to locate his remaining targets. When one of the gang members finally managed to produce a steady light source, Christopher was ready. Moving with the fluid precision that had made him one of the Army's most effective combat instructors, Christopher struck 3 more targets in rapid succession. Each engagement lasted less than 5 seconds, using techniques designed to neutralize threats while minimizing permanent injury. Within 2 minutes, only Richard Taylor remained conscious, standing in the middle of the room with a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other, trying to locate an enemy he couldn't see. "I know you're in here," Taylor called out, his voice echoing in the darkness. "You think you're some kind of ghost, some kind of superhero?" Christopher stepped into the edge of the flashlight beam, allowing Taylor to see him for the first time. "I'm just a father protecting his daughter." Taylor swung the pistol toward Christopher's voice, but his movements were too slow and too predictable. Christopher had already anticipated the response, moving to a new position before speaking. "You made a mistake when you threatened my family," Christopher said from the darkness. Taylor spun around, trying to track the voice, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly through the room. "Where are you? Show yourself! You sent someone to approach my daughter at school. You planned to kidnap her tomorrow morning." The tactical superiority was complete. Christopher could see Taylor clearly while remaining invisible himself. The gang leader was isolated, disoriented, and facing an opponent whose capabilities were far beyond his understanding or experience. "Your men are unconscious but alive," Christopher continued, his voice calm and controlled. "They'll wake up in a few hours with headaches and no permanent damage. You have a choice to make." Taylor fired 2 shots into the darkness, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the room and revealing the unconscious forms of his associates scattered around the floor. "What kind of choice?" Taylor asked, his voice now showing genuine fear. Christopher stepped closer, moving just outside the flashlight beam's reach. "You can leave Indianapolis tonight and never come back. Take your operation somewhere else, start over, and forget that my family exists. And if I don't, then you'll discover that threatening a child was the worst mistake you've ever made." Taylor tried to back toward the exit, but found his way blocked by Christopher, who had anticipated the movement. "I've killed more dangerous people than you. In places much worse than Indianapolis, Christopher said quietly. The only reason you're still breathing is because I choose to show restraint. But if you ever threaten my daughter again, that restraint will disappear. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical demonstration. Christopher needed Taylor to understand that he was completely outmatched. That further aggression would result in consequences far beyond anything the gang leader was prepared to face. "Who are you?" Taylor whispered. "I'm someone who spent 8 years learning how to eliminate threats like you. Someone who trained other soldiers to do the same thing. Someone you should have researched more carefully before making this personal." Christopher allowed Taylor to see him fully for a moment, standing in the flashlight beam with military bearing and cold, professional competence that left no doubt about his capabilities. "You have until sunrise to leave the city," Christopher said. "If I see you or any of your associates near my family again, there won't be a conversation next time." Taylor stumbled toward the exit, his flashlight beam wavering as his hand shook. At the door, he turned back toward Christopher. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Christopher replied. "You just don't understand that yet." After Taylor disappeared into the night, Christopher surveyed the unconscious gang members and the evidence of their criminal operation. He used cable ties from his tactical kit to secure each man's hands, then placed an anonymous call to Detective Thompson's direct line. "Thompson, Detective, this is Christopher Moore. You'll find 5 suspects and evidence of a major drug operation at the auto repair shop on Railway Street. They're unconscious but unharmed." "Christopher, what did you do?" "I protected my family. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine. The threat to my daughter has been neutralized." Christopher ended the call and disappeared into the Indianapolis night, leaving behind a scene that would puzzle investigators and send a clear message to anyone else who might consider threatening his family. The quiet security guard was gone forever, was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous and far more protective. The following morning, Christopher sat in Detective Thompson's office at the Indianapolis Police 15th Precinct, facing questions about the previous night's events. Through the window, he could see news vans gathering in the parking lot as word spread about the major drug bust at the warehouse district. 5 suspects in custody, 2 kilograms of cocaine, $40,000 in cash, and enough weapons to supply a small army, Detective Thompson said, reading from the arrest report. All of them claiming they were attacked by some kind of ninja. Christopher remained silent, his hands folded calmly in his lap. The interesting thing is, none of them have any serious injuries. Concussions, yes, bruises, certainly, but nothing that suggests the kind of violence you'd expect from a gang war or territorial dispute. "I'm glad no one was seriously hurt," Christopher said. Thompson leaned back in her chair, studying Christopher's face. "The forensics team found something interesting at the scene. Traces of military-grade breaching explosive on the electrical panel. The kind of stuff that's not available to civilian contractors. Is that significant?" "It's significant because it suggests whoever did this had access to specialized military equipment and the training to use it properly." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Captain Robert Hayes entered, carrying a thick manila folder and wearing an expression that suggested he had information that would complicate an already complex situation. "Detective Thompson, Mr. Moore," Captain Hayes said, taking a seat across from Christopher. "We need to discuss some developments in this case." He opened the folder and removed several photographs, spreading them across the desk. The images showed Richard Taylor at Indianapolis International Airport boarding a flight to Denver with 2 large suitcases. "These were taken 3 hours ago," Captain Hayes said. "Mr. Taylor purchased a one-way ticket and checked out of his hotel room this morning. It appears he's leaving Indianapolis, just as someone suggested he should." Christopher looked at the photographs without showing any reaction. "There's more," Captain Hayes continued. We've been monitoring communications between Taylor's associates and other criminal organizations in the area. The word is spreading that Richard Taylor's operation was taken down by someone with serious professional skills. Detective Thompson leaned forward. What kind of communications? Phone calls, text messages, social media posts. The story is getting bigger with each telling, but the consistent theme is that someone with military or law enforcement training dismantled Taylor's entire operation single-handed. Christopher finally spoke. Detective, am I under arrest? No, Thompson replied, but we need to understand what happened last night, and more importantly, what might happen next. Captain Hayes pulled out another set of photographs, these showing men Christopher didn't recognize. These are associates of Taylor's operation from other cities, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis. We have intelligence suggesting that some of them are very interested in meeting whoever caused their business partner to flee Indianapolis. You think they're coming here? We think it's possible. Richard Taylor's operation was part of a larger network, and disrupting one node often causes ripple effects throughout the system. Christopher processed this information while calculating new threat assessments. He had focused on neutralizing the immediate danger to Isabella, but hadn't fully considered the broader implications of his actions. What do you recommend? He asked. Detective Thompson and Captain Hayes exchanged glances before Thompson answered. Officially, we recommend that you maintain a low profile while we investigate these potential new threats. Unofficially, we understand that you have capabilities that might be relevant if the situation escalates. You're asking me to work with the police? We're asking you to consider that your family's safety might depend on coordination rather than independent action, Captain Hayes said. Christopher's phone buzzed with a text message from Ashley. Are you okay? Heard about arrests at warehouse. Call me when you can. I have to get back to work, Christopher said, standing up. Actually, that's another issue we need to discuss, Detective Thompson said. Community Medical Center has been receiving threats. Since news of the warehouse arrests broke, whoever is making the calls specifically mentioned you by name. Christopher sat back down, his protective instincts immediately alert. What kind of threats? Bomb threats, threats against staff members, promises of retaliation. Dr. Amanda Clark called this morning to request additional security measures. Is Ashley safe? All hospital staff have been advised to take precautions. We've increased patrols around Community Medical Center, but we can't provide personal protection for everyone. Christopher's tactical mind began analyzing the new threat matrix. His actions had successfully eliminated Richard Taylor as a direct danger to Isabella, but had potentially created new vulnerabilities for people he cared about. I need to see the hospital, he said. Christopher, that might not be wise. If these new threats are credible, showing up at Community Medical Center could make you a target. I'm already a target. The question is whether I'm going to be a passive target or an active one. 2 hours later, Christopher arrived at Community Medical Center to find the parking lot crawling with police cars and security personnel. Dr. Amanda Clark met him at the staff entrance, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of stress. Christopher, thank God you're here. We've had 6 bomb threats since this morning, and the caller keeps asking specifically about you. What exactly did they say? That the hospital would pay for harboring the person who destroyed Richard Taylor's operation. That staff members would be held responsible for your actions. Christopher scanned the hospital lobby, noting the positions of security guards and the obvious tension among staff members. Where's Ashley? She's working a double shift to help cover for people who called in sick. I think some of our staff are afraid to come to work. Christopher found Ashley in the emergency room, where she was checking on an elderly patient while maintaining constant awareness of her surroundings. When she saw him, relief was evident in her expression. "I was worried about you," she said, stepping away from the patient's bedside to speak privately. "The news reports about the arrests didn't mention your name, but I put 2 and 2 together. Are you safe here?" "As safe as anyone can be, with police cars in the parking lot and bomb threats every hour." Christopher looked around the emergency room, seeing the faces of staff members who were trying to maintain professional composure while dealing with threats that were completely outside their normal experience. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "No, it's not. You protected yourself and your daughter from people who were planning to hurt you. The fact that other criminals are upset about it doesn't make you responsible for their actions." Before Christopher could respond, Tom O'Brien approached them with urgent news. "Christopher, we've got a problem. Security cameras picked up 3 men in the parking garage who don't appear to be patients or visitors. They've been there for 20 minutes, and they keep asking about you." Christopher's expression hardened as his tactical training kicked in. "Where exactly?" "Level B, near the emergency exit. They're positioned to watch both the elevator and the stairwell. Call Detective Thompson and tell her we have a situation. Then initiate lockdown procedures for this floor." "Lockdown procedures? No one in or out until the police arrive. Treat this as a credible threat." Ashley grabbed Christopher's arm as he started to move toward the elevator. "Where are you going?" "To end this before it gets worse." "Christopher, you can't just go fight 3 armed men in a parking garage. I can't let them threaten innocent people because of something I did." Dr. Amanda Clark approached their group, having overheard the conversation. "Mr. Moore, I'm ordering you not to leave this hospital. As administrator, I'm responsible for the safety of everyone in this building, and that includes you." Christopher looked at the 3 people surrounding him. Ashley with concern and affection, Tom with professional respect, Dr. Clark with administrative authority, and realized that his actions had created a community of people who now had a stake in his survival. "You're right," he said finally. "But we need to get these people away from the hospital before someone gets hurt. How do we do that?" Christopher pulled out his phone and dialed Detective Thompson's number. When she answered, he could hear sirens in the background. "Detective, I'm at Community Medical Center. We have 3 suspects in the parking garage who are asking about me specifically. We're 2 minutes out. Can you maintain your position?" "Yes, but I want to make something clear. If these people escalate the situation, I'm going to respond appropriately." "Christopher, wait for backup. I'll wait as long as I can." Christopher ended the call and turned to Ashley. "I need you to make sure the emergency room staff are ready for potential casualties, not from me, but from whatever happens when the police confront these people. What do you think is going to happen? I think people who make bomb threats against hospitals aren't planning to surrender quietly." As if to confirm his prediction, the building's fire alarm system activated, sending piercing sounds through every corridor. Emergency lighting activated automatically, and the hospital's public address system crackled to life. "Attention all, staff and patients. This is a security alert. Please remain in your current locations until further notice." Through the windows facing the parking garage, Christopher could see police cars arriving with lights flashing, but no sirens. The tactical response team was trying to contain the situation without causing panic among patients and staff. "They're going to try to use the chaos to get into the building," Christopher said, more to himself than to the others. "How do you know that?" "Because it's what I would do." The lights went out suddenly, plunging the emergency room into the red glow of emergency lighting. Christopher realized that the 3 men in the parking garage had been a distraction while others infiltrated the hospital's infrastructure. "This isn't random," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood tactical operations. "Someone planned this." Ashley moved closer to him in the dimmed lighting. "What do we do?" Christopher looked around the emergency room, seeing staff members and patients who were depending on him to make decisions that would keep them safe. The quiet security guard, who had wanted nothing more than a peaceful life, was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes protecting innocent people required decisive action. "We defend this place," he said simply. Outside, the sound of gunfire erupted from the parking garage, followed by shouted commands from police officers. The battle for Community Medical Center had begun, and Christopher knew that everything he had learned about warfare was about to be tested in defense of the people he had come to care about. The emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through Community Medical Center as Christopher moved through the corridors with tactical precision. The gunfire from the parking garage had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that suggested the real assault was about to begin. "Ashley, I need you to coordinate with the other nurses to move patients away from exterior windows," Christopher said, his voice carrying military authority. "Tom, get on the radio and find out the status of the police response." Dr. Amanda Clark approached them, her medical training overriding her fear as she focused on protecting her patients and staff. "Christopher, we have 63 patients in the building, including 12 in intensive care who can't be moved easily. Then we make sure no one has to move them." Through the emergency room windows, Christopher could see tactical officers taking positions around the building perimeter. Detective Thompson's voice crackled through Tom O'Brien's radio. "All units, we have confirmation of 4 suspects down in the parking garage. Repeat, 4 suspects neutralized. However, we believe additional suspects may have entered the building." During the power outage, Christopher moved to the windows facing the main entrance, using reflections in the glass to scan for movement without exposing himself. His military training automatically catalogued potential threats, defensive positions, and escape routes, while his civilian instincts worried about the innocent people depending on him. "There," he said quietly, pointing to a service corridor that connected to the hospital's loading dock. 2 men moving toward the pharmacy. Tom squinted through the dim lighting. "I don't see anything." "They're using the construction scaffolding for concealment. Professional movement, coordinated timing." Ashley joined them at the window. "How can you see them when we can't?" 8 years of looking for people who didn't want to be found. Christopher's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We have your building surrounded. Send out the man who destroyed Taylor's operation and no one else gets hurt." He showed the message to Ashley and Dr. Clark, both of whom immediately understood the implications. "You can't seriously be considering going out there," Ashley said. "I'm considering ending this before anyone gets hurt." "Christopher, there are at least 6 armed men out there, probably more. Even with your training, those aren't good odds." Christopher smiled grimly. "They're better than the odds those men face if they try to hurt people under my protection." Before anyone could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed from the pharmacy wing. Christopher immediately moved toward the sound, with Tom O'Brien following despite Christopher's gesture for him to stay back. "Tom, you're not trained for this kind of situation." "Maybe not, but this is my hospital too." They reached the pharmacy corridor to find 2 men in dark clothing attempting to break into the drug storage area. Both were armed with handguns and seemed surprised that anyone had detected their presence so quickly. "Step away from the cabinet," Christopher called out, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. The 2 men turned toward him, their weapons raised. In the emergency lighting, Christopher could see their faces clearly. Both were older and more experienced than the gang members he had faced at the warehouse. These were professional criminals, not street thugs. "You must be the famous security guard," one of them said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Christopher couldn't immediately place. "The one who thinks he's some kind of soldier." "I don't think I'm a soldier. I know I was one." The second man laughed, was being the important word. "You're not in Afghanistan anymore, soldier boy. This is Indianapolis, and we're not some terrorists hiding in caves." Christopher's tactical assessment was automatic and immediate. 2 armed suspects, confined corridor with limited maneuvering room, civilian backup who needed protection. The situation required precise action to minimize risk to Tom O'Brien and prevent the suspects from reaching other parts of the hospital. Last warning, Christopher said calmly. Leave the building now and this ends peacefully. I don't think so, the first man replied, raising his weapon toward Christopher. What happened next lasted exactly 4 seconds, but Tom O'Brien would remember it for the rest of his life. Christopher moved with fluid precision that seemed to bend the laws of physics, closing the distance to the first gunman while simultaneously disarming him and using his body as a shield against the second attacker. The first man's weapon clattered to the floor as Christopher applied a blood choke that rendered him unconscious within seconds. The second gunman hesitated, confused by the speed of Christopher's movement and unsure whether to fire with his partner in the line of fire. That hesitation cost him the engagement. Christopher released the unconscious man and moved toward the second attacker with controlled aggression that eliminated any possibility of resistance. A precise strike to the wrist disarmed the gunman, followed by a palm strike to the solar plexus that dropped him to his knees. "Cable ties," Christopher said to Tom, who was staring at the scene with obvious amazement. "What? Do you have cable ties or restraints? We need to secure these 2 before they wake up." Tom fumbled through his security equipment, producing plastic zip ties that Christopher used to restrain both unconscious men. The entire engagement had been resolved without a single shot being fired and without any injuries to hospital staff. "How did you do that?" Tom asked, as they dragged the 2 men into a supply closet. Training and practice, lots of both. Christopher's radio crackled with Detective Thompson's voice. "All units, we have reports of additional suspects entering the building through the service entrance, requesting immediate backup for hospital security." "Detective, this is Christopher. I've neutralized 2 suspects in the pharmacy wing. They're secured and unconscious." "Christopher, what's your status? Are you injured?" "I'm fine, but there are more of them in the building." As if to confirm his statement, the sound of footsteps echoed from the main corridor, followed by voices speaking in hushed tones. Christopher motioned for Tom to remain with the restrained suspects while he moved to investigate. Through the emergency room doors, Christopher could see 3 more figures moving through the lobby area. These men were different from the previous attackers, larger, more heavily armed, and moving with military precision that suggested professional training. Christopher retreated to the emergency room, where Ashley and Dr. Clark were coordinating the movement of patients to interior rooms, away from windows and potential lines of fire. "We have 3 more coming through the main entrance," he reported. "These ones are different, better trained, better equipped." "Different how?" Ashley asked. "They move like soldiers." Dr. Clark looked up from her patient coordination. "What does that mean for us?" "It means this isn't just about revenge anymore. Someone hired professionals to come after me." Christopher's phone buzzed again with another message. "You have 2 minutes to come outside, or we start with the patients in room 204. Room 204 was the pediatric intensive care unit. Christopher felt something fundamental shift inside him as he read the message. These weren't just criminals seeking revenge. They were terrorists willing to threaten children to achieve their objectives. Every rule of engagement he had learned in the military applied to this situation. "Ashley, get Dr. Clark and evacuate everyone from the pediatric ward immediately." "Christopher, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to end this." Christopher moved through the hospital corridors with lethal purpose, his civilian restraints finally abandoned in favor of the warrior who had trained elite soldiers and survived multiple combat deployments. The 3 professional attackers had made a critical error by threatening children. They had transformed this from a criminal matter into a war. The first attacker was positioned near the elevator bank, providing overwatch while his partners moved toward the pediatric ward. Christopher approached from above, using the hospital's suspended ceiling system to gain tactical advantage. The engagement was swift and decisive. Christopher dropped from the ceiling behind the gunman, applying a sleeper hold that rendered him unconscious in seconds. The man's weapon was secured and his communications equipment disabled before his partners realized he was down. The second and third attackers were moving through the pediatric corridor when Christopher intercepted them. These men were indeed professionals, reacting quickly to his presence and attempting to establish fire superiority through coordinated movement. But Christopher's training was superior, his motivation absolute, and his tactical position advantageous. Using the hospital's layout to channel their movement, he isolated each attacker and neutralized them using techniques that were lethal in capability but controlled in application. Within 6 minutes, all 3 professional attackers were unconscious and secured, their weapons collected, and their threat to the hospital eliminated. Detective Thompson's voice echoed through the hospital's public address system. All clear. Repeat, all clear. Police have secured the building perimeter and neutralized all external threats. Christopher sat in the hospital's break room an hour later, surrounded by police officers, hospital staff, and paramedics, treating the minor injuries sustained during the confrontation. Through the windows, he could see news vans gathering as word spread about the attempted assault on Community Medical Center. Ashley sat beside him, checking a small cut on his forehead that he had sustained during the final engagement. "It's over?" she asked quietly. "This part is over," Christopher replied, "but there will probably be consequences." Detective Thompson approached their table, carrying a thick folder of arrest reports and evidence documentation. "Christopher, we need to discuss what happens next." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've now neutralized 9 armed suspects in 3 separate incidents over the past week. Word is going to spread through criminal networks across the country about what happened here." Christopher considered the implications. "You think more people will come after me?" "I think the opposite. Professional criminals aren't stupid. They do cost-benefit analysis just like any other business. What you've demonstrated is that the cost of targeting you and your family is prohibitively high." Captain Hayes joined their conversation. "We've been in contact with federal authorities about the men you stopped tonight. 2 of them have outstanding warrants in multiple states, and the third is suspected of involvement in organized crime activities across the Midwest." "What does that mean for my family?" "It means you've done more to disrupt criminal networks in 1 week than most police departments accomplish in a year." Dr. Amanda Clark approached their group, her expression showing relief mixed with professional concern. "Christopher, I want you to know that every staff member and patient in this hospital owes you a debt of gratitude. But I also want to know if we can expect more incidents like this." Christopher looked around the break room, seeing faces of people who had become more than colleagues. They had become a community that depended on each other for protection and support. "I don't think so," he said finally. "Word will spread that Community Medical Center is protected by someone who takes that responsibility seriously." Ashley took his hand across the table. "What about Isabella? Can she come home now?" Christopher smiled, feeling a weight lifting from his shoulders that he had carried for too long. "Yes, I think it's safe for her to come home." 6 months later, Christopher stood in the same hospital corridor where the final confrontation had taken place, wearing a new uniform that identified him as Director of Security for Community Medical Center. The promotion had come with a significant salary increase and the respect of everyone who worked in the building. Isabella skipped beside him as they walked toward the exit, chattering about her day at Madison Elementary School, where she was now known as the daughter of the man who had protected the hospital. She wore the recognition with the natural confidence of a child who had never doubted that her father would keep her safe. "Daddy," Mrs. Williams asked if you could come talk. On to our class about being a soldier, Isabella said as they reached Christopher's car. What did you tell her? I told her you're not a soldier anymore, you're a protector. Christopher smiled as he buckled Isabella into her car seat. What's the difference? Soldiers fight wars in faraway places. Protectors keep people safe right here at home. As they drove through the streets of Indianapolis toward their new apartment in a safer neighborhood, Christopher reflected on the events that had transformed him from a quiet security guard trying to disappear into civilian life, into someone who had found his true calling. The warrior skills remained, but they now served a different purpose, not conquest or destruction, but protection and peace. He had learned that running from his past wasn't possible, but transforming it into something positive was. Christopher Moore was no longer hiding from who he had been. He was using those skills to become who he was meant to be, a father, a protector, and a guardian of the community that had become his family. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.